ready, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
All right, sounds good.
All right, everyone, have a great session.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I can.
Fantastic. All right, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you're located. My name is Shawn Harrison, and I am a support engineer and also trainer for Pragmatic Works. And today we're going to be talking about SSIS 2012 and the CDC, or the Change Data Capture. So in my scenario today, it's going to be a little interesting. I've actually am running 2012 on a virtual image, only because I still do the majority of my work in 2008. So I'm working in a virtualized environment today. And if my slideshow will cooperate with me. All right, so the CDC, what actually is the CDC? We're going to touch briefly on what it does because, of course, the change data capture has been around since 2008. It was added as a way to track changes that were made on tables, but it was basically at the database level. So what we're going to be focusing on mainly today is the new components or the changes that they've made to it in SQL Server 2012. So instead of having to do all your work with the CDC inside of inside of the data or at the database level, you can now interact with it with SSIS, through SSIS packages and components that they've given you to do that. So just briefly to talk about what the CDC is, it tracks changes being made to tables. This is one of the big things. So anytime tables are updated, it's basically going to capture those changes and mirror them into another set of tables. Also manages the log sequence number, or the LSN, and uses them to restore. So, if you do encounter any kind of problems while updating a table, something happens, during that package execution, for instance, you have the LSN, or the log sequence number, which is going to be used basically to create a restore, to restore back to what you had, before those changes went wrong. And one of the big things about the CDC is that it works independently of triggers. So one of the ways that developers would track changes like this before the CDC back in 2005 was having to set up all kinds of triggers and functions to kind of manually do this work, to kind of create it. But when they introduced the CDC, the big selling point was that you don't have to work, you don't have to use any triggers or functions or anything like that. It's all there for you. You just enable it on the database, and it's essentially all that you have to do. So, but we're really going to focus on the new components in SSIS 2012, the components that will allow you to use the CDC. So first off, we have the CDC Control. So this is mainly used in initial loads. Well, actually, it's only used in initial loads, and manages the log sequence number. So when it's feeding data through the data flow, and it's starting or marking where the initial load is, and it's also going to mark where the load stops as well. So it's going to give you, your starting point. Then we also have a CDC source. So this is a data flow component, and what that does is it reads change data, and it passes it to other components that are downstream. So as data is being brought in to the data flow, the CDC source looks at it and determines, okay, is this an update? Is it a delete, or what is it? It basically marks it. And then it sends that down to the CDC Splitter. So basically, the CDC source is going to mark the data as, what it is, what each row is, and then the CDC Splitter is going to split that into the 3 different types. You have your inserts, your updates, and the deletes. So the package that we're going to be looking at, when I start building this package, it's going to look very familiar as something that you could possibly build as a performance tuning or a workaround in 2008, because it's very similar. You also notice some other similarities to like a conditional split almost. So it's almost like an advanced conditional split in a lot of ways. All right, so my slideshows are very short, so we're going to jump right into the demonstration. And as the caption says, what could possibly go wrong here? So let me get into my virtual environment. And let's see, you're in SSIS. I'm going to jump into Management Studio and show you the setup that I have here. So I have this particular database, which I'm just referring to as my CDC demo. And under the tables, I just have a few tables that are set up here. I have a DIM customer CDC. All I did in this case was I took an extract from the DIM customer table in AdventureWorks DW 2012. So it's just a small excerpt, really. In fact, if I look at this table, just do a select top 1,000, I have 200 rows. So just a small 200-row excerpt. And I also have a destination table. So typically, this table would be, say, if you're doing this across to another database or something like that, or a different server. But here, just for our purposes, my virtualized environment, I'm just putting it into the same database. Now, in this case, there's nothing here. So this table is completely empty and ready to be loaded. I have two other tables here as well. I have basically staging tables for deletes and updates. So these tables are going to be used later on once we actually start loading or do our incremental loads. But same structure as the table before. All right, now you'll also notice that I have nothing under system tables or file tables. So the first thing that we need to do, so I'm basically, there's two major things I'm going to do. I'm going to set up two different packages here. One is going to be for our initial load, and then the other package is going to be for an incremental load. So the first thing that we have to do, though, is actually enable CDC on the database. So ever since 2008, you've had that option to run a stored procedure that would enable it for you. So let me just open up a new query window and grab my queries. All right, so first thing I want to do is enable CDC on the database. You'll notice that there's going to be two different places that you have to enable it. So you have to enable it on the database, and then you actually have to enable it on the table as well. So I'm going to do that there, and also in the same query, grab another. All right, now we'll also have to add a primary key to that DIM customer CDC table. You're going to need that for net changes because the CDC, the big thing that it's going to be used for is for net changes, or capturing net changes, and capturing all changes. So net changes, usually what you're going to be using it for, but to use it for the net changes, you have to have a primary key. And then down here, below it, zoom in real quick, we are also enabling it on the table itself. So you'll have the source schema, source name, the table, the role is just as the admin, and that we're saying that it supports net changes, set to 1. All right, execute. Should take just a moment. Oh, always do that. One thing I forgot as well, you're going to need the SQL Server agent. SQL Server agent needs to be running. That is the one mistake I always make. So let me start that up. All right, so my SQL Server agent is running, and let's see, nothing underneath it. Okay, you can see, and let me just run this again just to make sure. It is going to give me an error message in this case. So there are a few things that's already been created, but just want to make sure that the SQL Server agent is aware. So you're going to see a few things now after running that. If I refresh my tables, I now have a whole bunch of system tables here. Well, let me scoot this over. So here are a bunch of CDC tables. So it's going to record all kinds of different things in here. So captured columns, any change tables. This is also looking at changes to the DIM customer CDC table, since I named that in this last part of my query. So all of these system tables are used for the CDC information. And you also notice that it gives it its own CDC schema. And also, down towards the bottom, the reason that the SQL Server agent has to be started is because you'll notice that it does create some CDC jobs. So capture, clean up, the two jobs it creates. So now this database and the table are enabled for CDC. So now we can actually start building packages and making changes to these. So I'm going to jump over into Visual Studio. Let's see, what do they actually call it now? It's instead of 2012, or in 2012, instead of calling it BIDS, it's now SQL Server Data Tools, I believe. I really miss saying BIDS. BIDS was so much better. So inside of my environment formerly known as BIDS, I'm going to create. I just have this particular project I've created, so I'm just going to create two packages. So the first one is going to be our initial load. All right, so initial load.dtsx. Now with the initial load, we're only going to have to run this one once, of course. And there's three different components we need to add to the data flow. So first we're going to start with the CDC Control Task. This is going to mark the initial load start LSN, or the log sequence number. So this is basically giving us a starting point. So in the toolbox, if I can get used to where they put everything, I have a CDC Control Task. And first thing we need to do is create a connection manager for it. One thing you'll notice too, and I'm glad they actually label it now in some of the components, is that you can see what type of connection it needs. So the CDC Control Task needs to have an ADO.NET connection manager. So if I just click New, and what do we have? Looks like I actually already have one. Perfect. So I'll select that one. So this one I just labeled as CDC demo, so, connecting to my local host. And then we have the control operation. So there's a few different options you're going to see here. Mark initial load start, load end, CDC start, also processing range and processed range. For our initial load, we just want this first option, mark initial load start. It's also going to need a variable that contains the CDC state. So that's going to hold our state information. Now, what's nice about this is that there's nothing in the drop-down, so you have to create a new one. Fortunately, you don't have to specify a data type. It's going to do all that for you. So, and it even gives you the default name. So it's great. It scopes into the package, gives me the default name for that variable. So, okay, I select it, and we're good to go. Now, the connection manager for the database where the state is stored. Of course, in this case, I'm storing it in the same database because I'm not transferring it across to, to another server or anything. But let's just say that I was transferring data from server A to server B, and I am setting up my CDC. Typically, what you'd want to do is the CDC would be enabled on the destination database. So you wouldn't have to keep it on the source, you just want to keep it on the destination database. So in this case, the connection manager for the database where the state is stored, that table needs to be created on the destination database, so on the destination server. So in my case, still just my local host. So I can reuse that same connection. Now, a table for storing the state is going to need a table. It's one of the system tables or one of the tables that isn't created as a system table. Fortunately, if I click New, because you'll notice there's you have tables here, but we have our customer table, our destination, and then the two staging tables. So if I click New, it's going to create the table for me, and what makes this even nicer is that it doesn't have a generic, say, like OLDB connection or something like that, or DB table. It just gives me CDC_states, which is fine. That's good enough. So I'll run that, and it creates a table for me. At the bottom here, you have the state name. So you can see it's already populated that for me. The state name value basically acts as a key for the CDC information. So if you have packages that are all accessing, the same, the same CDC information, then the same state data, then they need to use that same variable. So in this case, all of my packages are going to use that state name. So I click OK. I have my CDC Control Task. So the next thing I want to do is create a data flow that is going to copy all the rest of the source data over to my destination. So all I need to do here is find my data flow task. One thing I will say about 2012 is it's very difficult to get used to where they put everything because it's all mixed up. So in the data flow task, this is just going to be a very simple data flow task because, again, we're just simply copying all of the information or all the data from that original table, that source table, over to the destination table. So nothing special here. I'm just going to grab an OLDB source under Other Sources. And let me create a connection manager, which I already have one, so I'll just use this connection manager. And then the table or view, I'm looking for the dim customer_CDC. I can view my columns. Of course, it is going to throw an error. Well, once I get down to the destination anyway. So, okay, and now I just need an OLDB destination. So I'm not doing anything spectacular. It's a very simple load. So again, connection manager just the same. And I need to point it towards the dim customer_destination is my table. Okay, under the mappings, of course it's going to map that customer key, so I'm just going to get rid of that mapping. And okay, because remember we have a primary key set up on that table. And back to the control flow. So now I just need one more component, and it's going to be another CDC control task. So if I locate that one, oh, here we go, CDC Control Task. And my connection manager, of course, I'm good there. It's just picking up the ADO.NET connection that I already have. And then the CDC control operation. This time we want mark initial load end. And the variable containing the CDC state is going to be the same. So all of the settings for this are going to be the same as the CDC control, or the first CDC control task that marked the initial load, or the initial load start. And again, the table for storing the state, we just want to find CDC states. And the state name is already there. So this package is very simple to set up. And okay, so now we have our initial load. So when we run this, it's going to take all of the data, just as we specified in the that's in the source table, the dim customer_CDC, and move it to dim customer_destination. All right, so I will execute the initial load. I think they even moved execute package in the context menu. All right, so everything's loaded just fine. So I'll stop debugging, and let me jump over to Management Studio. And if I look at the dim customer table, or dim customer destination anyway, take a look at that. just to verify 200 rows have been loaded into that table. All right, let me also refresh my list of tables. And here's that CDC state table that was created. So if we look at that, here's what we end up with. Expand this out. So this is what the initial load has given us, because that CDC Control Task, this is what it's given us. This, this state right here, that LSN or log sequence number, this is really just a long string that's used only by the CDC components. So this isn't something that you'll ever have to, to really edit at all. In fact, don't ever edit that. It's probably a bad idea. But this is something that's only used by the CDC components. So this is basically marking that we had an initial load, and it happened, from this time to this time. So it gives us our starting point, essentially. All right, so now we want to create the package for the incremental load. So if I jump back into Data Tools and create a new SSIS package. All right, let me rename it. There we go. And I'll just call this one Incremental Load. So we're going to add quite a few more things to this component, or to this package here. So this package is going to be just a basic incremental load. It's a very common scenario that you're going to run into. So first we take another CDC Control Task. And it's going to start the entire package. And this time, we just grab a new connection. So I'm just using that ADO.NET connection again. And then we have the CDC control operation. So it's going to be different this time. Now, for the incremental loads, what we want to use here is this option right here, Get Processing Range. So that's going to start our processing range. Variable containing the CDC states. Well, just with all of the, the other package that we created with the CDC control task there, it's going to use the same type of variable. So just click New, and it's going to create it for me. CDC state, it scopes it to the package. All right, and then the connection manager for the database where the state is stored, again, it's already populated for me. And the table for storing that state, it's already there, of course, so I'll just choose CDC states. So all of the settings are going to be the same. The only exception is that CDC control operation. So we're just setting that to Get Processing Range. All right, so now we want to include a data flow task. So in the data flow task, here you can see some of the the other new components for SSIS 2012. First, I'm going to need, under the other sources, we have, that's transforms, other sources, the CDC source. So with the CDC source, this is going to bring in all of the new data and determine what it actually is. So the setup on this one, all we need first is the connection manager, because again, this is using the ADO.NET connection manager, and we're just setting it up to the source database, or the source table. And then the CDC enabled table. So you'll notice it even specifies right there that it's going to need the CDC enabled table. So even if you tried to choose something that wasn't CDC enabled, which you'll notice there's only one there, you can only choose something that is enabled or has CDC enabled on the table level. So I'll just select my table. it already has the capture instance here, the dim customer underscore CDC. And then you have processing mode. So these are the types of changes that you can get. So you can capture all the changes with the old values, net changes, net with update mask, and net with merge. Normally, 2012 hasn't been around that long, so the CDC probably hasn't been used very often, but right now, typically the situation you're going to find is that you would use the net processing mode. And then the variable containing that CDC state, which is already there. So the great thing about this is it's almost like, I don't know, to me it feels almost like a wizard, how it just kind of walks you through everything. It doesn't leave a whole lot of room for error. It pre-populates a lot of the fields and just pretty much narrows down all of your options as far as tables and variables to only what's there and what's available. It's basically telling you, we're not using anything other than this, so just pick from what we got. That's about it. So we have our columns. You're going to notice as well these other columns in here. The start LSN, operation, and the update mask. Those are all added by that CDC source. And that's how it's going to mark, what type of data it's getting. Okay, so now we have our CDC source. So now we're going to need the CDC Splitter Transform. Now this is pretty nice because if I find, I guess under other transforms, I have CDC Splitter. I'm going to drag this out here and drop it. With the CDC Splitter, there's absolutely nothing I have to do. So that makes it pretty nice. You have your input and output columns, you can see their properties, and that's it. There's nothing that I have to manually go through and configure. All right, so once we take that information, feed it through to the CDC Splitter, then it has to go through different, whatever path, the different paths. You're going to have your inserts, your deletes, and your updates. So I'm just going to come down here and grab, where'd it go? Oh, destinations. Still getting used to this toolbox. OLDB destinations. So the OLDB destination 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to rename these just so I can keep them straight. So we have our new records, updates, and the deletes. All right, so I'll just grab the data flow and toss it over here to new. It's going to ask you about an output. So a lot just like using a conditional split or something like that. Any output, you're going to have to specify which output it is. So in this case, all my new records are my inserts. It labels it for me. And then my next one is going to be the updates and also the deletes. Now I just have to create the connection to each table. So my inserts, my OLDB connection manager, just grab the CDC demo. And the table, of course, is going to be the dim customer underscore destination. My mappings, let me ignore the customer key there. And then in my updates, my update table, it's already got my connection manager. And I'm going to send this to, let's see, this is updates. Yes, the updates. This one is going to go to the staging table. So dim customer updates, or staging dim customer updates. Okay, oops. And one thing that I do love about 2012, for those of you that haven't used it, even though I set up a connection to a completely valid table and it errors out, it's going to tell you right there that you actually still have some issues. So it gets a little bit better. For you guys that haven't used 2012 yet, it makes things a little bit easier. So certain errors that you can see before you even execute a package, whereas in 2008 you'd execute a package, then hit the error. It kind of prevents that in this case, which is very nice. I like it. So let me go and ignore that one. Okay. And then in the deletes, same connection manager, we're going to point this to the dim customer delete, the staging table, or staging dim customer deletes. All right, so our data flow is complete now. So if I jump back into control flow, there are two other components we're going to need here. Nothing new, but we have the execute SQL task. We're going to need two of these actually, because these are going to update or run the update statement for our updates and our staging, or I'm sorry, our updates and our deletes. Updates and deletes. Now, this is something that I could do inside the data flow as well. I mean, I could very well, if I really hated efficiency, I could go in and use, say, an OLDB command inside of my data flow for my updates and my deletes. But I like to performance tune things as much as I can, so I try not to use the OLDB. Try not to use the OLDB command as much as I can. So for our updates and our deletes, I'm going to go into the updates, and I can just use OLDB, that's fine. Alternatively, you can also use the ADO.NET connections. You could reuse that connection if you wanted. So I'll just use my CDC local, or localhost CDC demo 1. And the SQL statements. Let me find my queries here. So here is my update statement. So I'm just using this to take everything that's in that staging table and update my dim customer destination table. Okay, and I want to do the same thing for the deletes. Point to the same connection manager, SQL statement. Let me just grab my query. And okay. Okay, so that's all that we have to do there. Now, one other component that I'm going to need, since we started off with the CDC Control Task, we also have to end with a CDC Control Task. So if I find my CDC task, oh, here we go, under other transforms, or other tasks, bring that in and hook that up to the deletes. And again, it's just the same settings as before, except this time the CDC control operation is going to be mark processed range. So it's taking everything that the data flow has loaded, and it's basically marking it at the beginning, with the CDC control task, saying that, okay, here's the first incremental load, and then it goes through the data flow, does its thing, and then this task at the end, the CDC control task that we finish the package with, is marking it as the end. Okay, this is it, and includes that inside the LSN, that log sequence number. So the variable containing the CDC states, again, it's already got the variable for us, and I just point it towards that CDC state table, and the state name, it's going to be the same. Every package that accesses that table needs to use the same state name. And okay. So here's our incremental load. Now we ran our initial load, and everything's fine, but what happens if we run the initial load? Let me jump into this data flow and execute the package. If all goes well, I won't get any errors, and actually you won't see anything happen at all. So the package successfully completed with an error. Well, oh, you know what? I bet I know what it is too. But anyway, as far as the data flow goes, you're going to see that there's no rows that are moved because, of course, nothing changed. So, nothing has changed since that initial load. So if I stop debugging, jump back out here in the control flow, find out where my error was. Probably shouldn't have stopped debugging. Execute, deletes, failed. Oh, okay. I bet I know exactly what it was. Let me jump back over to my control flow. My deletes, and stupid parentheses. Always a parenthesis. If you've watched any of my other webinars, I always leave out a parenthesis. All right, now, just to make sure that that's what the issue was, go ahead and execute that package again, but still you should see no rows actually moved. All right, so everything's successful. And again, no rows removed. So let me stop debugging. All right, so now what if we actually change some of the data? You know, I want to take whatever else I had from the AdventureWorks DW 2012 DIM customer table and move the rest of that into the source, or my CDC demo table here. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to jump back over into Management Studio, start a new query, and let me grab my query really quick. All right, so this is just going to take all that information from that DIM customer table, and it's going to put that into our DIM customer source table, so our sample table basically. So execute that. Should take just a little bit, and I end up with 17,984 rows. So that's going to copy everything else that I had into that table. So those are going to be some new inserts we're going to see. So inserts were good. You know, we still have nothing that would be updated or deleted. So for the rows that are already there, I want to go ahead and change some of the data. So in that actual table, and let's see, where is my DIM customer destination? Or DIM customer CDC, I'll use that one. Let me take a look. In this table, it's like one of the best things we can use here would be yearly income, probably. So let's go ahead and bump that up a bit. Grab one of my queries. So I'm just going to bump it up by 100. All right, and that has affected 100 rows. Excellent. So now I have all this extra data, and I've already run the initial load before. So that initial load package, again, you're only going to need that one time. So nothing else I'm going to have to do there. So I want to go into the data flow here, and let me add a data viewer. So I'm going to add a data viewer. Again, look at that. That's one of my other favorite. Whoa, that's not what I wanted. There we go. It's one of my other favorite features of 2012 to add a data viewer. It's just right there, enable data viewer, and it gives it to me. So much better than 2008. All right, so I'm enabling a data viewer here so we can take a look at the data after it hits that CDC source. You can see, you know, what information we end up with here. All right, so I'm going to run this incremental load package. So I'll execute the package. So here is the data viewer. And let's take a look at the first few here, the first few columns. First off, you have the start LSN number, or the start LSN. So this is not something you're going to have to worry about or deal with. This is just identifying, you know, the execution essentially. Next to that is the operation. So it would mark it as, you know, either being an update, an insert, or a delete. So that number is, you know, is going to change. Scroll down. Let me see if I have a scroll bar. There it is. So in this case, I have some different ones buried in there somewhere. Let me close out of that. And now you can see some data actually moving here. So it looks like we have our inserts are moving, our updates are done already, so it's into the staging table. And we didn't have any deletes. So if I jump back to the control flow now, data flow already finished. It sent it to our updates, and then sent it to the deletes as well. And then the control flow task at the bottom, which marks it as the process range. So if I stop debugging, and if we take a look at that customer destination table, you'll see that now we have a lot more rows. We went from 200 to well over 1,000. I just selected the top 1,000, but you can see that it's actually here. We do have the information. It transferred it over. Now, if I look at the CDC states table, and see we still have just the initial load, but it's going to say if we ever needed to do a restore, it's going to be able to use the number that you saw from that data flow, from inside this data flow, and that data viewer. It's going to be able to use that to identify when these changes took effect, what initial load does it go to, and it will allow you to build a restore point off of that. So this data flow right here is probably one of the nicest features for some of the new components in 2012, because when you look at it, it almost kind of looks like, say, a slowly changing dimension wizard. You know how you're able to walk through the slowly changing dimension and how it determines what's going to be new, what's going to be updated. But this is one of the ways that the way it does it here, though, is much nicer because it doesn't restrict you to using, say, an OLDB command. You can use any type of destination that you want. So a lot like those best practices examples that you saw in 2008 when your performance tuning packages, much like that. But now you can actually build it. It's built right into 2012. Now, if I were to remove the data viewer, if I were to run that incremental load again, of course nothing has changed, so you're not going to see any rows being moved. Package still executes just fine, but there's no rows that are moved. And I'll stop debugging. So again, the main things to remember that you're going to need when using a CDC and also using it, or interacting with it with an SSIS package is, first off, enable the CDC on the database with that stored procedure. Let me jump back in there or find that query again. Yep, I probably closed out of it. But with that particular stored procedure, and then also enable it on the table as well. So it's enabled at the database level and the table level. Oh, here we go. Let me just paste it in here again, just as a refresh. So that's the stored procedure in 2012 you use. Just execute that and enable CDC at the database level. And then again, enable it at the table level. With this stored procedure. And also, again, make sure you have your SQL Server agent running, and then you can create the initial load and incremental load for initial load and incremental load packages for that, to use that CDC. Okay, so this was really just, again, a basic demonstration of the new CDC components in SSIS. Hopefully you got quite a bit out of that, but that is all that I have at this point. Any questions that I'm unable to get to, I will be following up with in a blog. So you have the URL for my blog here, so I can follow up as much as possible. That will be posted very soon, as soon as Rachel sends them all over to me. And again, you can also follow me on Twitter And thanks for attending. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of this. Sorry, Rachel, to cut you off there.
Oh, no
Also,
problem.
there's a lot of great information that's starting to come up on the CDC and what you can actually do with it in MSDN, books online, and also some outstanding blog posts out there as well. Not only what we saw here today was saving the changes that you're making to tables, you can also find some outstanding examples out there too that are starting to come up on how you can use the CDC to or those LSN numbers to restore back to previous changes.
Okay, awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will email all these questions. See, we've got quite a few to Shawn, and he will follow them up in an extensive blog post, so please do look for that. And you can see Shawn's blog right there on the screen, and he has a lot of other really great posts as well. He's also doing another webinar later on in the month, so check that out. What's that one on again, Shawn?
That is using the new parameters in SQL Server, or I'm sorry, SSIS 2012.
Ah, perfect. And yes, Gary, this whole session has been recorded, so the demo he did will be posted as a recording on www.pragmaticworks.com under the webinar. So, and you just click the past webinars tab and you'll be able to see the whole thing, including the demo. And all right, everyone, make sure to get those questions in the questions panel, and I will pull them and send the report to Shawn so that he can do an extensive blog post follow-up. And thank you for joining us. Thanks, Shawn, for an awesome session.
No problem. Thank you. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Have a great day, everyone.